I am Bernard Dan, Editor-in-Chief of Developmental Medicine and Child Neurology. I recently wrote an editorial about aging with a developmental disability. Today I'm having a conversation with John Starr, who's a Professor of Health and Aging at the University of Edinburgh. Hi John, thank you for doing this.
Good afternoon to you, Bernard.
I'd like to ask you whether you see similarities between gerontology and adult presentation of neurodevelopmental disorders.
Yes, there are. We cover very similar areas of syndromes, if you like, in terms of cognitive impairment, in terms of continence, in terms of mobility, and in terms of many age-related features such as frailty, osteoporosis, etc.
Are there important differences as well?
I found out when I was working and I started to work with people with Down syndrome, I thought I would be very good at working with them because they have many of the aging features that older people in what we might call the kind of general population have. But of course, they come from a background of always having had a neurodevelopmental disorder, and so they don't present in quite the same way as you might expect for someone who was in their 70s or 80s with similar problems. They don't present similarly in terms of cognition, nor do they in terms of mobility or other features. So although the general impairments and the general areas affected could be similar, because of the background of the person, because of the context of their life course, things are actually quite different.
And do you think that the so-called geriatric giants can still be useful here?
They do adapt, and I thought when I started working with people that it would adapt very easily. I was used to working with people who had communication difficulties, people who had difficulties with cognition and mobility and multimorbidity, and you can use those perspectives. But the difficulty is it's not exactly the same.
There seems to be a risk then of overlooking important aspects when applying a classical geriatric perspective, or for that matter a paediatric one.
Yes, and one of the things that I found was you need to find from the people themselves what they consider to be health. Some of that is to do with social function, some of it is to do with hygiene, and some of it is to do with, if you like, self-worth and other aspects to do with diet. As with everybody, some of the concepts are things that they've received from society, what's good to eat, what's healthy to eat, and some things are generated, I think, from within themselves, the idea of a social value, if you like, being very important to people.
You emphasize the person's position. Is there also something specific with regard to the family's views?
There is, although for the people I was dealing with, most of them had lost touch with their families and often in group homes, but the family do have an important aspect. But the family's perspective often is more conventional and fits in with a medical model. I find in my practice that it's better, particularly with people with intellectual disability, to actually understand what their perspective is.
Now, going back to geriatrics and paediatrics, do you think those fields can learn from each other?
Yes, very much so. What happens to you in your early years does impact very much on what happens to you in your later years in life. People who have lower IQs have a higher risk of dementia, even when you adjust for other things. Their health is impacted, not just their physical health in terms of diseases, but also things like how well you breathe, what changes go on in your brain. And we know also from a small proportion of these who had birth records that actually what happened to them at birth impacted on their IQ at age 11. So there's really the life course perspective is really important for older people. An older person isn't just an older person, they're a person who has aged over time.
A few individuals with developmental disability told me they felt they were aging faster than any other people. Is there some biological or social evidence for that?
Well, obviously for some syndromes, such as Down syndrome, and in your editorial you mentioned cocaine, if you look at the risk of dementia, if we set aside people who have Down syndrome, but we look at other people who would be labelled as having an intellectual disability but non-syndromic, they tend to have the risk of getting dementia about 10 years earlier than those in the general population. So if you look at age-related disease as a measure of aging, yes, there is some truth in that.
Yet there's a general gap of knowledge in the field. What do you think should be the next step for research?
One of the things that I'm interested in at present is epigenomics. Status of methylation of DNA is a much better predictor in older people of life expectancy and a range of other diseases than actually how old you are chronologically. And we know that there are changes in how genes are expressed and functioning over time. less, I think, is known in the population with neurodevelopmental disorders. And this is an area that I think would benefit us from understanding, because whatever environmental influences there are, mostly are likely to act through epigenetic mechanisms.
There's quite a bit of work to be done by you and by us. Let's make sure we keep the convergence and the conversation open about all these issues. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you very much.